on an island in the Philippines called El Nido. Beautiful island, not very developed. And they had one McDonald's on the island, which to me was even surprising that there was one McDonald's there. It was absolutely packed at all times, like probably the most crowded McDonald's I've ever been in. And there was a time my girlfriend and I were going to eat there after a day at the beach, and it was line out the door, absolute mayhem. We were like in a mosh pit trying to get to the front of the register. And I noticed that they had a conveyor system on the roof bringing all the food out to drivers or folks that were ordering off premise. And that was pretty cool to see because you're on this undeveloped island in the middle of the Philippines and you're seeing this high-tech solution, helping solve some of their pain points.
Welcome to Whisking It All with your host, Angela Esposito, co-founder of WISK.ai, a food and beverage intelligence platform. We're going to be interviewing hospitality professionals around the world to really understand how they do what they do. Welcome to another episode of Whisking It All. We're here today with David Goldstein, both the managing partner at FoodTech Connect and recently the vice president, or as the most recent, I should say, the vice president of growth at Franklin Junction. David, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Angelo. Excited for the conversation.
Of course, yeah. I'm super excited to chat, to learn more about your background and your experience in the hospitality scene. So maybe a good place to start is just the obvious, which is you have a passion for food and technology. So I always like to understand maybe how that happened. How did those two worlds kind of intersect? Yeah,
definitely. Good place to get started. So I think separately, food and technology have always been passions of mine. I think when I was in school, I never expected food would be part of my full-time job. I always kind of was drawn to technology and startups and venture capital, and that was kind of my thinking coming out of school. And actually, what I focused on in school was entrepreneurship. So was always coming out of school, applying very underqualified to most of the major tech companies, thinking that was going to be my jumping off. I think I was pretty fortunate that I managed to get an interview that turned into a job with a new division at Uber at the time, which was UberEats. And that was really kind of my introduction to food technology. When I started at UberEats, there was no UberEats. It was Uber testing at the time what was called Uber Instant in the Rider app, which was a really, really fun part of the job and kind of a good way to get my feet wet. We would meet up with Uber drivers in parking garages in Washington, D.C. at the time with about 200 sandwiches from a local restaurant and put them in the back of their trunk. And you would open up the Rider app between 11 to 1 p.m. You get a push notification, say, hey, I want to get lunch within 10 minutes from X restaurant. And you'd open up the Rider app and you'd see, order 1, 2, or 3 sandwiches, three different options from one local restaurant. And that was Uber's kind of first attempt at food delivery and how I really got my feet wet. Not scalable, but really fun, especially for, a new guy out of school trying to get their feet wet. So yeah, that was the introduction. And I fell in love with working with restaurant owners, working on technology, kind of working at that intersection. So I've been really happy since.
That's awesome. That's so cool. I'm just trying to imagine that. That's in the tech world, we always speak about MVPs, minimal viable products, but it's to hear, Uber's so big, sometimes you forget where they started, or you don't even know. I didn't know that story, but it's pretty neat to just imagine that. And just out of curiosity, not to go too much into Uber, but I'm curious, what happened after that? What'd you do after, you're shipping these 200, 300 sandwiches every day, doing a bit of testing, seeing if there's a need? What was the next evolution of that? I'm curious to know version 1.1.
Yeah.
What that looked
like.
I
was brought on at the tail end of that. I guess you can call it an experiment. And the next phase of that was the Uber Eats marketplace. I think the learning.
Oh, full on.
Yeah, the learning during that experiment was food delivery is a great way to leverage the excess capacity we have from our drivers on the road, but at the same time, people want more selection. The one restaurant at lunchtime is in demand, but people want more selection. Yeah. So I think about a month or two after me joining the team, they launched the formal marketplace. And then it was just a full-on sprint to get as many restaurants on board as you can. And it's interesting because at the time, UberEats, the business direction was to only offer, I guess you could call them high-end meals or meals from top-rated restaurants. There was no focus. In fact, I got my hand slapped a few times for trying to start conversations with some of the local chains and fast food restaurants. And we had a very narrow profile of what we thought we wanted restaurants to be on the Uber Eats app, and what we thought consumers wanted. Yeah. And I think that was version 1. It was almost similar to like the Postmates model, if you will.
It's super interesting how sometimes, and for our listeners, I'm sure this will be one little nugget to take away, but as much as you might build your MVP, you test, you iterate, and then you go with your, hypothesis, but sometimes your hypothesis is completely wrong, right? Like in that case, thinking like, high-end restaurants will be great. And then, kind of the opposite happened and people wanted quick service or fast casual. And it's funny how sometimes what you think is right just proves not to be. So being open-minded, I think is super key when, building a business.
100%.
And speaking of businesses, I'd love to hear a bit about your business. So I'd love to understand a bit, and you could tell our audience, you have a lot of restaurant listeners, people in the food space. So, what is Food Connect? Tell our audience a bit about it.
Yeah, definitely. I launched FoodTech Connect in 2019, end of 2019, early 2020. After my time at Uber, I was at Uber for about 4 years. And the thinking then was, how can I leverage a lot of the experience that I had at Uber, but not only the experience, the network I built on the enterprise side with SMB restaurants, and a lot of the strategy around go-to-market and whatnot. And so at the time, leaving Uber in 2019, I had a few restaurant tech companies that I was talking to that were interested in expansion and leveraging some of that experience. So at the time, I was thinking I was just going to work with early stage startups on go-to-market strategy, enterprise strategy, really helping them expand in the US. And then when COVID hit a few months later, it was a catalyst of a few things. I think most importantly, a lot of restaurant brands started reaching out to me saying, hey, you sold us on this food delivery thing. Now 90% of our business is going off premise. What should we think about? Okay. What should we optimize? How should we strategize, going into the next couple of years? So that was an interesting point, because then I was working with early stage startups on how to work with operators, but also working with operators and brands on, how to think about technology, implementing technology, what kind of trends they should be looking for in the space. So more or less, that's what we've been doing since 2019, is really bridging the gap. Yeah, it's been exciting and fun ride.
That's super cool. And out of curiosity, do you have a typical, type of client that you guys work with? Is it, QSRs, FSRs, or is it anybody that needs help, period? Like, curious to know, like, what does that look like?
Yeah, well, I think given my experience both on the startup side and on the operator side, they generally are pretty delivery focused. So it could be a brand that, has a big delivery business or is looking to grow their delivery business, or it could be a startup that is adjacent or some way touching food delivery.
That makes sense. And I guess with your experience being involved in, restaurant consulting and operations, what's some, or at least one maybe, of the unexpected lessons that you've learned from the industry?
Yeah, that's a good question. Personally, I truly think that restaurants are the backbone of society globally, really anywhere you go. I think for a variety of reasons, people need to eat, the social aspects of going to restaurants, the learning aspects at a young age of, being employed at a restaurant, which is often, folks' first job. I think from my experience in the industry, one of the things that I've learned is resilience. I think resilience from an operator standpoint. I think it's always been tough to own a restaurant. It's never been tougher than right now to own and operate a restaurant. And, why folks are doing this is not because they want to make a ton of money. It's because it's the passion of theirs, right? They love hospitality, and that's why they're doing it. So I think resilience from that standpoint, but then being on the tech side of things at UberEats and beyond, I think resilience from selling into and working with restaurants, right? Like, selling into restaurants is a whole different beast, than any other type of sale for a variety of reasons. And, I think you need to have resilience to be successful in that space too, not just with sales, with restaurant tech, but I think in all aspects, right?
Yeah, it's funny because at WISK, I mean, again, not to make this about WISK, but a quick anecdote. Obviously, we sell into restaurants, and when we first started, it was one of the challenges. Is like, to your point, sales is hard, but selling to restaurant, there's a lot of gatekeepers, and in fairness, they get bombarded by a lot of apps, so I don't blame them. But trying to get the decision maker, or trying to get the right person, or just them having the time. Sometimes you schedule a meeting and things come up. Yeah. Again, totally understandable. Things come up. The chef didn't show up, whatever. But like, it's tough, and then on right, typically later hours, different hours, like, so it's interesting, but it does present a totally separate set of challenges than a typical maybe tech company. And the other thing you said that I also just wanted to emphasize, because I totally agree, is that I think restaurants, I think about travel, your take here, but like when I think about traveling, what makes a city cool, there's many factors, but one of the first things is the restaurants, right? Like, and so sometimes you take it for granted, but it's like, oh, I want to go to Montreal. Why? Oh, I heard it's a cool restaurant scene. Or I want to go to X place in Spain or Italy or Portugal, or I want to go to Lisbon. Like, one of the first things that makes that city cool is not the list of chains it has. It's those cool restaurants, bars, whatever it may be, local shops, sandwiches, whatever. You get the idea. But the point is, like, it's funny. Sometimes we take it for granted, but it's like, it's what makes a city cool. And it's usually the difference between living in, a rural or an urban area is a lot of the times is like the selection of restaurants to a certain extent. I'd love to know. Yeah.
Couldn't agree more. No, I couldn't agree more. I'm an avid traveler, and the biggest motivation behind that is to experience different cultures through that lens, right? I was just in Asia for 6 months, eating my way through through different countries for the back half of 2023, and my family met me out there at the end. And the trip with my family was very different than the trip I had previously. And they were asking, "Oh, what did you do in this country and that country?" We did a lot of cool things, but everything that just came to mind was all the cool restaurants that we ate at. I wanted to tell them, like, "Oh, we had this restaurant in Japan, and this restaurant is just," they don't know what any of that is or what any of that means, right? So it's very different. But yeah, that resonates for sure.
That's funny. That's awesome. And then I'm curious to know on the tech side of things, right? Because you kind of have that intersection of both sides, which is obviously really relevant for what you do. How do you see technology maybe changing the way we dine and experience food in the near future?
Specific markets, specific countries in Asia are very far advanced when you think about food technology. And that was part of my motivation for going out there. And it kind of felt like I was getting a look into the future. Maybe 10, 15 years ahead from where the US is in some aspects, and especially when it comes to technology and automation. I think things that I'm pretty bullish on, and not just buzzwords, but I think truly relevant, are automation via robotics and AI. That's starting to hit restaurants. I think still in its infancy, but you're starting to see adoption. I think from a front of house standpoint, and I saw this firsthand in markets like China, Korea, Japan, you're going to see, robotics taking a lot of the lift off of front of house staff like waiters and bussers, which is going to allow them to provide better hospitality, right? As opposed to just order taking, running trays back to the kitchen, they can really focus on telling you about the restaurant, why they're different, about the cool things on the menu, really getting to know you and providing what I consider true hospitality, right?
Yeah.
I also think, AI, artificial intelligence in the front of house is going to help customize and tailor and personalize the experience for every consumer. Back of house, I think similarly, robotics is going to take some of the mundane tasks off of kitchen staff, which is going to help with things like turnover, right? And just provide a better work environment. And labor's never been tougher than right now. And AI in back of house is going to help with back office tasks, reporting, inventory management, things like that, which I know, you guys at WISK are working on. So I think robotics and AI, I think we're in the infancy, but I think there's going to be some really cool examples moving forward on how it's helping, ease operators day to day.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And out of curiosity, like any anecdotes you can share from your trip, like of just things you saw, whether it's robotics related or not, but that made you feel like, oh man, this is 10 years in the future.
Yeah, 100%. I don't even think it's these examples are maybe super futuristic, but definitely examples that you don't see in the US. There's two examples that come to mind. One was on an island in the Philippines called El Nido. Beautiful island, not very developed. And they had one McDonald's on the island, which to me was even surprising that there was one McDonald's there. It was absolutely packed at all times, like probably the most crowded McDonald's I've ever been in. And there was a time my girlfriend and I were going to eat there after a day at the beach, and it was line out the door, absolute mayhem. We were like in a mosh pit trying to get to the front of the register. And I noticed that they had a conveyor system on the roof bringing all the food out to drivers or folks that were ordering off premise. And that was pretty cool to see because like you're on this undeveloped island in the middle of the Philippines and you're seeing this high-tech solution, helping solve some of their pain points.
That's so cool.
So that was cool. And then another example was in a hotel in China, in Xi'an in China. There was many times I was going up and down the elevator with these robots, and I was like, this is pretty cool, but I didn't really, understand what they were doing. And then we ordered food delivery one day, and I came down to get my food. And right as I was coming down to get my food, the delivery driver was loading the order into a robot. And that's when it clicked that what these robots are doing is they're acting as food runners. Bringing food up and down the elevators, whether it's for room service or for food delivery that folks are ordering at the restaurant. And I was just thinking, in the US, there would be a massive line of drivers around the concierge trying to, fight to get their order handed off, and the concierge ringing the recipient in their hotel room, trying to get them to come down. And this is just, such an easy solution that was providing real value, right? People get their food quick. The concierge doesn't have to, run orders up and down. There's no waiting. So that was cool. And then I really appreciated my time in the elevators with the robots for the rest of our time in that hotel.
That's awesome. I think that's one of the coolest things about traveling is the inspiration you get, right? Where like you can just see so many things, whether it's just from a tech perspective, a design perspective, anything really, just a concept perspective. Like, there's so many ideas you can get, and sometimes like just stepping out of your bubble and traveling, I think is awesome. Speaking of, I know you're currently not based in the US. I know you're kind of hanging out, if I'm not mistaken, in Mexico. So I'd love to just quickly touch on that. Like, what made you want to kind of live that remote life? I mean, sounds pretty awesome, but just curious to know, like, what made you want to do that, and how's that going?
Yeah. Well, it's going great. I've been based in Latin America mostly since 2019 when I left Uber.
Hey, wow.
And Uber was actually what brought me down here originally. UberEats, after the rapid expansion in the US, had expanded to Latin America. And I remember, I think it was Mexico City it was the first city that they launched here, and overnight it became like one of the biggest cities for UberEats to manage, and it was a bit unexpected. So they were just shipping people from the U.S. and Europe down to Mexico to help with operations and on the ground. And I wasn't part of that first wave, but I think it was part of the second wave, which was when they were expanding outside of Mexico and trying to blitz to some other markets down in Central and South America. So that's when I got my feet wet in Latin America. I was a launcher for a few markets down here. It was one of the coolest experiences of my life, I must say. It was a little under a year that I was down here. And then my next assignment with Uber was in Chicago, working in Uber's internal incubator. I'm from Florida originally, so after one Chicago winter, my skin was too thin, and I was dying to get back to LATAM. So I left Uber and moved to Colombia, actually.
That's awesome. I love Colombia. It's one of my favorite places to visit. That's so cool. And so like, out of curiosity, what are some differences you see, like in terms of like just the like from your perspective working there, right? So like obviously there's a ton of cultural differences, but like culture wise, from like, you working, let's say in the US and now you working there, have you noticed anything that stands out?
There's definitely a lot that stands out. I think, like you mentioned, it's culturally very different, and it's also Latin America is massive, right? And when you go from country to country, there's a lot of cultural nuances between countries.
Yeah.
I think as a result of that, a lot of my work experience down here hasn't been on the front lines as much as it is in the U.S. because of those cultural nuances. The work I've done back here is mostly kind of insulated a bit and mostly on the strategy side and operations. But I think the biggest takeaways, especially during my time down here with Uber, was Latinas are incredibly motivated, hardworking people. I think they sometimes don't get all the credit that they deserve. And that's a lot of the reason that I'm incredibly bullish on the region from an economic and startup perspective. I really think there's a lot of cool things going on down here with a lot of really bright people.
It's interesting you say that, because my next question to you that I wanted to ask was that, I read that you were an aspiring venture capitalist to a certain extent. And so I'd love to know, you're talking about your belief in Latin America. So what kind of startups, I guess, or projects get you excited? Whether it's food and hospitality sector or not, I'm curious to know what gets you excited. What are you looking for as a VC?
Yeah, I think a lot of now what gets me excited, given my experience in food tech, is food tech related. I think the same way I look for clients to work with, employers, or companies that are cool, I think is the same way I would look at venture capital down here, which is what are companies or trends in the space that are providing real value to operators. And I don't want to be too repetitive, but going back to some of the automation that I think is ripe to take foot in food service, there's a lot of cool companies doing cool things around AI, automation, robotics down here and abroad. Some of which I've worked with, some of which, I've only been watching from afar, but, those are all very relevant.
That's cool. And working with, I guess, early stage startups, do you have any, and unless it's private, but do you have any maybe projects that you can consulted on or worked on that you could, stood out to you that you'd like to share? If you can, maybe they're private and you can. So
I think one that comes to mind, I've worked with a lot of really cool, really innovative companies. I think I've been fortunate in that. But when I think of the most high-tech solution, maybe futuristic, is this company, not based in Latin America, based out in the UK, in London, called Satis AI. And their solution, Mo, the founder, incredibly bright guy. He came from healthcare tech and AI in healthcare, so a very different field, and saw kind of some of the inefficiencies and how restaurants operate, and wanted to provide some of his experience. And what he built at Satis AI is essentially a computer vision AI camera that sits in the back of house in restaurants and can see the operation, see the food being assembled, see how the different workers are moving around in the back of the kitchen, and provide real-time insights to help the employees. So what this looks like is, on their KDS, as they're assembling in a burger, step by step, when they put the burger on the bun, it'll check that off. When they put the lettuce on, it'll check that off. Oh, you forgot the tomatoes on that burger? As they close the bun and seal the bag, ding, 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 they letting you know, hey, you forgot the tomatoes on that burger. That person ordered a double patty, you only put a single on. You forgot the Coke in that bag. So it's solving a lot of issues for consumers, but most importantly, helping employees. I mean, a lot of the strain on employees in the back of house is the cognitive load, right? Especially when things get fast. There's a bunch of things moving around. Yeah. So taking that cognitive load off of employees, which is reducing stress, which is improving their lives. It's improving the lives of consumers because they're getting the right food that they ordered. So yeah, I mean, that's a project that I really love.
And then just switching gears, just to quickly touching on the VC side of things. I think people are always wondering or looking for maybe tips on how to successfully raise capital. So I know there's probably 1,000,001 tips, but from your perspective, being on the other side, any pieces of advice you want to share to people looking to raise capital in the startup space that are maybe in the food tech space?
Yeah, well, the fundraise, I don't know what's harder right now, to be a startup raising capital or be a restaurant owner.
It's the two hardest things.
Yeah, the fundraising scene right now is done a 180 to what it was a few years ago, right? Which is it's interesting. Obviously, what investors want want to see now is not just fast growth, but profitability. So it's an interesting time to be a startup founder. I think today you have to have a really sound business. And that's not just hey, we're going to blitz scale and grow really fast. You have to go back to the fundamentals. What makes a strong business? How can we be profitable from day one? How are we not burning cash? What are, LTV, CAC, things like that have to be tighter than ever. So I think it's the fundamentals. Yeah. I think that's what the investors want to see more than like a really cool idea, a really innovative idea. I think that's important, but I think that takes maybe a backseat, a secondary seat to what are your fundamentals? What are the business metrics? How healthy is the business today?
Makes sense. And with that said, I always like to give a chance to just kind of plug how people can find you. So like really, if you want to share websites, social media, whatever you want, it's your chance.
Sure. I'm active on LinkedIn, David Goldstein. You can find me there. I'm leading growth for Franklin Junction, www.franklinjunction.com. We are actively recruiting new host kitchen partners in the US and internationally. Definitely get in touch.
Love that. Well, you heard it here first, guys. We're here with David Goldstein. Thanks for joining us on the Whisking It All podcast.
Thank you, Angelo.
Feel free to check out WISK.ai for more resources and schedule a demo with one of our product specialists to see if it's a fit for you.